The bailiff called the case, and the air turned metallic, as if the room bit back. Nadia said, "Breathe, Maya," and my lungs obeyed like they were on loan from courage. Imran said, "We trusted him, and I tasted rust behind my teeth." Arif shuffled in cuffs, 24, and evasive, and Aunt Sarah hissed, "Keep quiet," like silence could rewrite math. Miss Qureshi said, "We lead with the paper trail," and slid her pen like a scalpel. I whispered, "He emptied my college fund," and the words felt heavier than the folder. Arif said, "It was a loan," and the judge's eyebrow lifted like a warning buoy. My receipts throbbed in my grip, corners soft from nights I didn't sleep. Z's hand brushed my shoulder and she murmured, "You did the work, now make it count." The clerk stamped Aug 11, 2025, and the thunk sounded like a verdict falling early. I remembered streetlight study sessions, and the way hope used to smell like old paper. The courtroom's wood gleamed, but every reflection was a bruise we would have to name. I didn't come to be brave, I came because the numbers dragged me by the wrist. Ms. Qureshi said, "We show intent before excuses," and the plan slid into place like a blade in its sheath. Arif studied the table lacquer, as if reflection could defend him. Nadia murmured, "You earned that fund," and it sounded like a blessing stitched from late nights. Imran said, "Tell it plain," and my mouth remembered every figure like prayer beads. I said 9 withdrawals over 9 months, and the clerk looked up as if arithmetic could blush. Arif said, "Startup timing forced me," and the word forced ticked like a faulty clock. Z leaned forward and whispered, "Anchor yourself," and my spine found the center of the chair. The judge observed us with a patience that looked expensive. I imagined a classroom that should have had my name on a roster. Today my roster line was this table, and the subject was restitution. Justice Rauman said, "Proceed," and the word rang like a bell that never liked music. Ms. Qureshi rose and said, "This is theft dressed as family," and the gallery inhaled together. The defense smiled with a tie brighter than his argument, and said, "She consented." I felt a laugh scrape my ribs because consent does not forge signatures at midnight. Nadia closed her eyes as if silence might fold time back. Imran watched Arif like a man reading smoke. Z's braid slid over her shoulder and she whispered, "Hold the line." I said, "My name was misspelled to bypass caps," and the clerk's pen slowed. Arif said, "I would have paid it back when we launched," and the tense betrayed the truth. The judge rested his hand on a file, as if steadying the room. Somewhere in my chest, the door that money should have opened creaked. The first receipt slid across with a whisper sharp as a cut. Imran said, "Read it," and I did, numbers clicking like beads on a wire. I said, 9 withdrawals equal a year of home tuition and a semester abroad, and the math held. Arif said, "It was seed money," and Ms. Qureshi replied, "You sowed with stolen grain." The projector blinked awake and threw cold light on warm lies. Nadia murmured, "We celebrated Eid while this bled," and the memory curdled. I said, "He texted free seed money the night I sat a mock exam," and Z squeezed my wrist. The defense cleared his throat as if sound could pad a fall. Aunt Sarah looked at her bangles like they might chime a defense. The judge's pen tapped once, a small metronome of consequence. My folder felt heavier, as if every digit had grown bones. The shock wasn't the theft, it was the smile he wore while it happened. Arif said, "We're family," and I said, "Family doesn't misspell me to lift a cap." Nadia whispered, "We fed each other that night," and my stomach turned at the remembered sweetness. Imran said, "I didn't see the drain," and shame bent his shoulders. Ms. Qureshi said, "Intent lives in patterns," and laid out the timeline like a spine. Z murmured, "You kept studying while it vanished," and the word kept stitched me together. The defense said, "She is angry." And I said, "I am precise, because precision is anger that did its homework." The judge lifted his gaze and the room steadied as if gravity adjusted. Aunt Sarah's eyes glossed with something that wasn't apology yet. I pictured a lecture hall, and a seat with dust on it, waiting for my name. I promised that seat I would arrive with interest. The question landed like a stone in water when Miss Qureshi asked, "Why this fund?" I said, because it was the only thing I owned that felt like a door. Z, behind me, her braid neat as a promise, whispered, "You'll walk through anyway." My voice steadied in the echo. Imran's gaze dropped to the floor tiles, tracing the cracks like maps of regret. Nadia's hand rested on her lap, fingers knotted, not looking up. Arif glanced sideways, his smirk brittle as glass, as if the weight of my answer scraped him raw. The judge shifted slightly, watching me over his glasses, expression unreadable but patient. My chest rose and fell with something sharper than fear. It was hunger for the life they had almost erased. The folder on the desk between us was no longer paper. It was a key I had carved myself. Every late-night tutoring, every early morning lesson, every skipped meal, all pressed into those pages. I said, "I won't let it close." Arif's lawyer leaned into the mic and said, "Guardianship paperwork from 2012 gave his mother limited management." Ansira, spine-stiff, replied, "For safekeeping." Miss Querishi's eyes sharpened. "The word limited lives to be misunderstood," she said, sliding the document forward. My pulse drummed as she tapped the clause that required dual consent for any withdrawal over 50,000. I said my consent was forged. The defense shifted, avoiding my stare. Nadia's lips parted, but no words came. Imran's jaw tightened as he read the clause, knuckles whitening on the bench. The paper itself seemed to hum with proof. Sarah's bangles clicked faintly when she crossed her arms, her gaze somewhere far from the courtroom walls. The judge leaned forward, fingers steepled, and the air felt as if it had just been sealed in. The silence stretched, taut as a rope holding all our years together. The clerk projected my account timeline on the wall, and every downward dip matched a lie told over chai. Imran muttered, "I didn't see it." Nadia said softly, "We should have." Arif, arms crossed, shrugged. "Everyone makes mistakes." I turned to him and said, "Only some of us pay for them with our lives." The red lines on the graph were like open wounds, each deeper than the last. Z leaned forward in her seat, eyes fixed on the data like it was a crime scene photo. Ms. Qureshi stood with her hands behind her back, the screen's blue glow reflecting off her glasses. The defense tried to look bored, but their pen tapped too quickly. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in as the truth stacked higher. I thought of every time I had trusted their smiles, and how each point on that graph was the price of my trust. The twist slithered into daylight when Miss Qureshi said, "We have call logs." Z whispered, "Play the recording." Arif's knuckles blanched as his voice filled the speakers. "I'm the designated," the banker replied, "not without Maya." Then came another voice, Sarah's, calm, certain, "I'll handle the girl." My stomach twisted. Nadia's head snapped toward her sister. Imran's brows knit tight enough to crease his forehead. Zira didn't flinch, just stared ahead like the words weren't hers. The judge scribbled a note, the pen scratching loud in the hush. The defense shuffled papers, avoiding the weight in the room. My hands curled around the edge of the table until my nails bit wood. That single phrase, "Handle the girl," echoed, stripping the years of family dinners down to raw intent. "Handle the girl," I repeated, my voice steadier than I felt. Zira finally said, "I meant reassure." Nadia's tone cut clean. "You meant remove." The judge lifted a palm. "We will stick to evidence." Ms. Querishi's lips curved, the kind of smile that meant she was holding more. Arif shifted in his seat, the cuffs clinking softly. Imran's gaze burned across the aisle at his sister. The gallery leaned in, sensing a thread ready to snap. I sat back, my fingers loosening, the words still rattling in my skull. "Handle." The defense tried to speak but swallowed it down. Somewhere in my mind, I saw the younger version of me, the one who thanked Zira for keeping my savings safe, and I wanted to warn her. The gavel rested, waiting for its turn to punctuate. Z leaned forward and said, "Tell him why it matters." I breathed once and answered, "Because I studied by streetlight when the power cut out, Because I taught 6th graders algebra to afford practice tests. Because this fund wasn't gifted. It was mined from sleep. The words sat heavy in the courtroom air, pressing into every corner. Arif looked down, his gaze skimming the floor like it might offer an escape route. Nadia's eyes shone with a mix of grief and pride. Imran leaned forward slightly, as though to anchor me with his presence. Miss Qureshi gave a small nod, one lawyer to her client, but also one fighter to another. The judge shifted his weight, his pen stilled above the pad. I kept my gaze straight ahead, because if I looked away, the truth might blur. The folder in front of me didn't just hold numbers, it held the story of how I had carried myself this far without their help. Arif broke the silence with, "I built Apex Raid for us." Ms. Qureshi's voice cut in clean. "For us" is the oldest mask for me. She turned to the whiteboard and drew 3 lines. Withdrawal, transfer to shell account, payment to influencer. The red ink curved like arterial paths, undeniable. I stared at the diagram, each arrow a theft with a time and date. Nadia shook her head slowly, lips pressed tight. Imran's fingers tapped once on his knee, then still. Zizi's brows pulled together as she mouthed the chain silently, tracing the route of my stolen future. The defense lawyer leaned back, folding his arms like the ink could erase itself. My pulse matched the rhythm of Miss Query's pen cap snapping shut. In that moment, the startup dream looked less like ambition and more like appetite. The defense tried to reshape me into someone vengeful. "She's here for revenge," he said. I met the judge's gaze and said, "I want what's mine, and I want the truth notarized." The gallery stilled, leaning into the heat of the moment. Justice Rahman's eyes lingered, as though weighing the furniture of truth in his mind. Nadia looked at me as if seeing the steel she'd feared I didn't have. Imran's lips moved silently, repeating my words like a quiet echo. Arif sat stiff, his jaw tight but his eyes darting. Miss Qureshi adjusted the papers in front of her, a quiet punctuation. Revenge might have been the accusation, but the truth was simpler. Justice has a ledger, and mine had been in the red too long. I kept my hands flat on the table, my voice steady, and refused to let the weight of their lies bend my back. Miss Qureshi placed a trust amendment on the desk, her nails clicking against the paper. "Dated 2 summers ago," she said. The bold text named Arif as alternate beneficiary upon academic non-enrollment. Nadia gasped, sharp and involuntary. My pulse surged as I said, "I deferred 1 semester to work." Arif replied, which triggered the clause. His tone carried a satisfaction that prickled my skin. The word clause felt like a knife hidden inside a handshake. Imran's shoulders stiffened, and the gallery buzzed faintly. Sarah stared at the table, jaw tight, as though her silence might erase the ink. Z's eyes widened, darting between the paper and me. The judge leaned forward, scanning the text with a slow, deliberate hand. Every line felt like a trap laid in my absence. Nadia's voice cracked. "Who added that?" The pause thickened until Syra said, "I did, to protect the fund." Miss Qureshi's tone sharpened. "Protect it by funneling it." Imran's hands opened and closed, catching nothing but air. Arif kept his gaze low, mouth tight. Z glanced at me with the kind of anger that only friendship can hold. The gallery murmured, until the judge's gavel tapped once for silence. My stomach felt like it had been scooped hollow. Sarah's eyes slid to me briefly before retreating. Nadia's face folded inward, the betrayal landing again in fresh layers. I thought of the younger me, working double shifts, never imagining that protection could look like this. Every seat in that room suddenly felt too close, the air too full of lies to breathe easily. We broke for 10 minutes, and I found myself by a narrow window where the city heat pressed its forehead to the glass. Z joined me, her phone in one hand, the other holding the USB like it was a detonator. "There's more in here," she said, voice low. "Voice notes. Inline conte." My throat felt dry. "Play the ugly truth," I replied, watching a bus crawl past below like it too carried something heavy. Imran lingered near the corridor's far end, his hands clasped behind his back, shoulders sagged in thought. Nadia sat on a bench, looking down at her lap as if the pattern in her scarf might rearrange into an answer. The hallway smelled of paper, polish, and the faint bitterness of coffee cooling somewhere. I pressed my palm against the glass, grounding myself, and thought, if these notes were what I feared, there would be no turning this back into family. The first note crackled alive. Arif's voice, casual, saying, "Cousins don't invoice cousins." The second, Sira's, soothing, almost kind. "She's young, she'll forget." The third was my own from a year ago, bright with trust. "Thank you for keeping it safe." The playback ended, and the air thickened as the meaning rewrote itself in real time. Nadia's hands flew to her face. Imran's head dropped forward. Z met my gaze, no words needed. Miss Qureshi closed the laptop with a measured click, like she'd just filed another nail into the coffin of their defense. My stomach tightened with the realization that my gratitude had been their green light. The hallway noise dimmed under the roar of my own blood in my ears. That younger me hadn't been naive, she had just believed protection was a two-way street. When we reconvened, Arif tried to claim the stage. "I'm not a thief," he said. "I'm an entrepreneur." Justice Raman's tone stayed even. "Entrepreneurship is risk with your own money." A faint chuckle rippled through the gallery like distant thunder. The defense lawyer scribbled something without looking up. Miss Qureshi didn't move, her stillness almost louder than the judge's words. Nadia sat straighter, her eyes narrowing at Arif. Z's mouth quirked, just barely, the ghost of satisfaction. Imran's jaw eased slightly, as if the judge had placed a hand on his shoulder. Arif shifted in his seat, but the cuffs at his wrists kept any gesture short. I let the moment breathe, committing every detail to memory. The sound of the gavel resting, the smell of varnished wood, the awareness that some truths land best without shouting. "Your Honor, we move to admit the bank's fraud flags," Ms. Qureshi said. The projector lit up red blooms on the screen, each a flagged transaction, each a night I'd lost sleep. I pointed to one and said, "That was during my entrance exams." Nadia covered her mouth, her eyes glistening. Imran leaned forward, tracing each date like he was reading a wound. The defense leaned back, exhaling through the nose, a man pretending disinterest. Z's gaze was fixed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The judge's pen tapped against his notes as he studied the screen. The red icons seemed to pulse in the dimmed light, a heartbeat made visible. The air smelled faintly of overheated electronics and paper. This wasn't just evidence. It was a timeline of erosion. The defense pivoted to my character. "She's dramatic," Sarah said, her tone sharp. I looked at the judge and answered, "I'm precise." Ms. Qureshi spread a spreadsheet on the table, columns neat as marching soldiers. "Precision leaves no room for doubt," she added. Arif's eyes flicked toward the paper but didn't linger. Nadia's expression softened briefly as if recognizing the steadiness I'd grown into. Imran nodded once, slow. Z smiled faintly, her pride slipping through the tension. The judge leaned in, scanning the lines, then glanced at me as though weighing my words against the numbers. The courtroom had gone utterly still, the hum of the ceiling fan the only sound. I sat with my back straight, every muscle holding the shape of someone who had built her case from the ground up. I had braced for the day Arif might say sorry, but apologies are currency he never learned to mint. Instead, he said, "You were never going to use all of it." My laugh cracked in the middle. "I was going to use every line," I replied, the words slicing clean. Imran from the bench echoed softly, every line, like a prayer he'd just discovered. Nadia's gaze burned through Arif, unblinking. Miss Qureshi didn't look at him, only at the judge, as if she decided his words were irrelevant. Z's fingers tapped on the back of my chair, a quiet rhythm of solidarity. Arif's lawyer shifted in his seat, as though trying to dissolve into the wood. My receipts, stacked beside me, felt like bricks, each one proof of a future built and stolen. I imagined hauling those bricks into the life I'd planned, building something higher than his reach. Miss Qureshi unfurled an email chain, each page sliding like a new blade. The banker's words leapt out. Client's uncle signed an addendum under pressure. Imran's hand froze mid-air, his signature staring back at him. Saira said it was routine, he murmured, voice low. Saira's eyes locked on the desk, unmoving. Nadia's shoulders stiffened, as though absorbing the hit herself. Z glanced between the paper and my father, her mouth pressing into a thin line. The defense tried to object, but faltered, the judge's raised palm stopping him cold. My pulse thudded in my ears. The email wasn't just ink, it was the quiet confession of trust weaponized. I wanted to fold it into my folder of receipts, not for evidence but as a reminder. Even ink can bruise. Z leaned forward. I have a call recording, she said. The defense rose to object, but the judge waved it through. The room filled with Saira's voice. After the clause, no one can touch it. Arif's answer came quick, almost eager. Then it's ours. The word ours clanged in my skull, breaking into jagged pieces. Nadia inhaled sharply. Imran's jaw set hard. Miss Qureshi scribbled a note without looking up. The defense lawyer's pen stopped moving entirely. My chest felt tight, but not from fear. This was the confirmation that turned suspicion into a living thing. I didn't look at Arif or Saira. I looked at the judge, making sure he heard every syllable. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was design. We request restitution with interest, plus punitive for breach of fiduciary duty, Miss Qureshi said. The defense muttered, excessive. Justice Rahman didn't look up. Let's first find the floor before we argue the ceiling, he replied. His tone was calm, but it held the weight of finality. Arif sat still, but his fingers twitched against the tabletop. Nadia glanced at me, her expression unreadable, but her eyes held a quiet pride. Imran exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders loosening just enough. Z tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. The gallery seemed to lean in without moving, waiting for the next turn. My own heartbeat was the only rhythm I heard. The climax came when Arif finally looked straight at me. If I pay, I lose everything. My voice didn't shake. You lost me when you started. Nadia's voice followed, low and steady. And you lost us when you lied. The gallery was silent, the kind of silence that feels like holding breath before lightning. Imran's gaze didn't move from his nephew. Z's hand rested on my shoulder, grounding me. Miss Qureshi's expression stayed measured, but there was a flicker of approval in her eyes. Arif's face tightened, a flash of something, fear or resentment, before he looked away. I felt the moment settle into place like a stone at the bottom of a river, undisturbed but unmovable. On cross, I didn't raise my voice. I raised every receipt. One by one, I slid them across, the sound of paper hitting wood turning into a drum beat that made heads in the gallery tilt forward. Arif's answers began with sentences, then shrank into phrases, then single syllables that barely left his lips. The defense lawyer's pen trembled slightly, a detail I caught in my peripheral vision like a tiny crack in a dam. Miss Qureshi stood still beside me, her eyes scanning each page like she had memorized every comma. Nadia leaned forward, chin resting on her hand, her gaze locked and unblinking on her nephew. Imran's eyes moved between the receipts and Arif's face, measuring both. Z sat back, arms crossed but her foot tapping under the bench, a quiet metronome of fury she didn't speak aloud. When the defense finally said, "No further questions," it sounded less like a legal conclusion and more like someone choosing to leave a burning room. I gathered the receipts into a neat pile, heavier now, not from the paper but from the silence they'd created. Justice Rahman leaned forward slightly, the wood of the bench groaning under the shift. "This court recognizes harm beyond numbers," he said, his voice steady but weighted. His gaze found mine and held it, and for a moment, the air around me felt cooler, as if shade had been pulled overhead. "But we are bound to remedy what we can count," he continued. Miss Qureshi gave a slow nod, her pen poised above her legal pad like a final signature waiting for its moment. Arif shifted in his chair, the cuffs at his wrists clinking softly, the sound barely registering over the quiet in the room. Nadia let out a breath she'd been holding so long it shook. Imran's head dipped in a single nod, almost a bow, the kind that said he heard something he could live with. Z's eyes met mine, and in them I saw the shared understanding that this was the first true step toward the end. The hum of the ceiling fan was slow, even almost ceremonial as the judge's pen touched paper. I could almost hear justice taking shape in the loops and lines of his handwriting. The order came down like a final chord at the end of a long, tense symphony. Full restitution within 60 days, interest compounded, legal fees, and a formal finding of breach. Justice Rahman read aloud, his voice leaving no room for argument. Arif's head snapped up, disbelief etched into every muscle. 60, he said, stretching the single word like it could change its meaning. The gavel's single rap cut him off, sharp and absolute, echoing against the courtroom walls. Nadia's hands clasped together in her lap, her knuckles whitening as relief and grief braided themselves together in her expression. Imran closed his eyes for a beat, then opened them toward me with something between apology and pride. Z grinned openly, her first unguarded smile of the day. Miss Qureshi jotted a quick note, the flick of her pen almost triumphant in its economy. The defense lawyer began packing up his files without looking once at his client. I sat still, letting the sound of the gavel echo inside me, feeling it settle in all the places that had been holding their breath for years. Cyrus stepped into my path in the aisle, her bangles catching a thin slice of light from the open doorway. "You know I love you," she said, her voice low, almost pleading. I held her gaze, letting the quiet fill the space between us before I answered. "You loved the idea of me, quiet." Her mouth pressed shut, the silence between us introducing her to itself. Behind me, Imran's hand landed gently on my shoulder. "Come, daughter," he said, the words carrying a warmth I hadn't heard from him in years. Nadia walked a few steps behind, her expression unreadable but softer than it had been all day. Z hovered at my side, her eyes moving between me and the exit, ready to match my pace. The aisle felt long, and yet with every step the air grew lighter, the weight sliding off my shoulders and settling somewhere far behind me where it could no longer reach. Outside, the noon heat wrapped around us like a thick, bright blanket. Z stepped close, her voice firm but warm. "You did it." I shook my head. "We did it." Beside us, Ms. Qureshi glanced at her phone, already pivoting to the next step. "Now we enforce," she said, the words more promise than plan. Nadia joined us at the top of the courthouse steps, blinking hard against the sunlight. Imran paused beside her, looking down the busy street as though measuring the distance between then and now. The city moved below, horns sharp, colors bright, heat shimmering on the asphalt. I drew in a deep breath. The air tasted like iron and mango, sharp and sweet in equal measure. Relief stood beside me, but I knew it was a guest, not a tenant. Still, I let it rest its hand on my shoulder for a moment, accepting the fleeting comfort before the work ahead. Then, folder in hand, I stepped down into the sun. Resolution was never going to be neat, but it came quietly that evening in the form of a phone vibration on my nightstand. I picked it up, half expecting nothing, and saw the bank notification. Deposit received. The amount was heavy enough to make my stomach flip. My thumb hovered over the screen before I opened the app, watching the new balance sit there like an unfamiliar guest in my house. Nadia's voice came from the doorway, soft and certain. "Alhamdulillah." I nodded, though my chest felt tight. "One brick is not a house," I said, more to myself than to her. She didn't answer, only stepped back into the hall. I set the phone down, the screen fading into darkness. Lying back, I felt my body sink into the mattress in a way it hadn't in weeks, my thoughts finally loosening their grip. Outside, the city hummed. But in here, there was only the slow, steady rhythm of my breathing. Later, I found my father on the balcony, the city lights flickering behind him like scattered embers. He gestured to the empty chair beside him. "I failed to read," he said after a pause. I sat, the cool night air pressing against my arms. You trusted your sister, I replied, not as an accusation, but as a fact we both had to live with. He nodded, eyes on the horizon. Twice the lesson then, he murmured, raising his glass of lemonade. I clinked mine against his, the chipped rims knocking softly. The sweetness of the drink cut through the bitterness that still lingered between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, listening to the quiet rustle of leaves, two people sharing a seat at the same table again after too long. The city moved on without us, and we let it. The next morning, Z sat across from me at my kitchen table, hair still damp from a rushed shower. "And roll again," she said, no preamble. I grinned despite myself. "I'm returning in spring." She leaned back, sipping tea. "You owe those sixth graders new stories," she said. I laughed, surprised at how easy the sound felt now. "First, I owe myself a campus ID," I replied. She raised her cup in mock salute. My laptop sat open between us, the re-enrollment form glowing on the screen. I stared at the empty fields, fingers poised over the keyboard. The cursor blinked like it was keeping time with my heartbeat. Somewhere in the kitchen, the kettle clicked off, the steam curling into the air. This was what building back looked like, not all at once, but one deliberate step at a time. That afternoon, I drafted an email to Ms. Qureshi about setting up a small scholarship in my grandmother's name, the woman who taught me to multiply before I could even write my name. "Let's make my fund grow claws for girls like me," I typed. Moments later, her reply came, "Consider them sharpened." I sat back, looking at the old photograph of my grandmother propped beside my desk, her sari neatly pleated, her eyes bright with the kind of intelligence that didn't always get a classroom. My fingers hovered over the keys, already outlining the criteria for applicants. Outside, the street vendors were calling, the scent of frying snacks drifting through the open window. This wasn't just restitution, it was transformation. The final scene came without fanfare. I placed the folder of receipts on the highest shelf, its tab facing out, where it would gather dust instead of fingerprints. "I won't live in the archive," I murmured. Nadia, passing by the doorway, stopped just long enough to say, "Then write the next chapter." I smiled faintly, not at her, but at the thought of what that chapter might hold. The room felt different now, lighter, as if it too had been holding its breath. I ran my fingers over the cover of a fresh notebook on my desk, the first page still blank, a university bus pass tucked inside. As I stepped toward the door, the morning light caught my shoulder, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I was walking toward it.